de ouro, quem tem é o marechal. Lott é o ideal, porque defende o regime que é meu e de você.
Defende o regime que é meu e de você.
O Brasil precisa
De um braço forte.
Eu vou,
Tu vais.
vamos votar no Lott.
Eu vou. Tu vais.
Vamos votar no Lott.
How's it going, folks? Welcome back to another alternate history scenario. The focus of this video today is the nation of Brazil. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to the following viewers: Jiaozin6, who suggested the scenario, and Danny is now 1004, who added on to this by introducing me to the fascinating historical figure of Marshal Henrique Teixeira Lott. Now let's get into it. For Brazil, the 20th century was a tumultuous period, comprised of revolution, strife, democracy, and authoritarianism. The 19th century had seen the nation's independence from Portugal and the birth of the Brazilian Empire, while the early 1900s were consumed with the fallout of the empire's demise via a military coup in 1889 and the emergence of the First Brazilian Republic. After the instability and violence that marked the beginning of the Republic of Brazil during the 1890s, Brazil entered the 20th century as a weak, decentralized republic dominated by a patron-client system of political machines and agricultural oligarchs, resulting in a very decentralized government. These oligarchs and their political machines held sway over national governance, with the agricultural powerhouses of São Paulo and Minas Gerais having an extremely disproportionate amount of power over the other Brazilian states, thanks to their massive agricultural sectors. This system of rule was later termed café com leite politics, or milk and coffee politics, since national power was concentrated in the tycoons of the Brazilian coffee and dairy industries. The era of milk and coffee politics continued for decades, while resentment against the Brazilian oligarchy grew amongst the rest of the country, who resented their lack of political agency. The late 1910s and 1920s saw the rise of manufacturing as Brazil became an industrialized state, something which would begin to weaken the political power of the agricultural barons. Furthermore, the global demand for coffee fell in the aftermath of World War I, compounding the oligarchs' loss of influence concurrent with the rise of an educated Brazilian middle class, very eager for political change in the nation. Various revolts and strikes broke out across Brazil throughout the 1920s, as new ideologies entered the national political discourse and the government began to lose support amongst all sectors of Brazilian society. The last straw came on March 1st, 1930, when the old regime held the election that would unknowingly be its last, pitting the pro-establishment Júlio Prestes against Getúlio Vargas, an anti-establishment politician backed by a wide variety of disparate parties who all sought to bring an end to the old order. Following an election that suffered from extreme interference and cheating, Júlio Prestes was declared the winner despite many across Brazil refusing to recognize the election's results. On October 3, 1930, Getúlio Vargas and his supporters across the country launched a revolution to destroy the old order and install him as president. The Brazilian Revolution soon spread across the nation. The Brazilian military, fearful of a civil war, launched a preventative coup against the oligarchic government on October 24th, toppling the Brazilian government and ending the era of milk and coffee politics. On November 3, 1930, Getúlio Vargas arrived in Rio de Janeiro, then the capital of Brazil, and assumed the presidency. Vargas, a revolutionary defined by his nationalism and populism, quickly set about centralizing the Brazilian state. Backed by the military and church and ruling by decree, Vargas would rule Brazil for 15 years, centralizing the Brazilian government, dismantling the old political order, and radically transforming nearly every aspect of the country. Under Vargas, Brazil pursued closer ties with the United States of America and launched a campaign to modernize and finish industrializing the nation to become economically healthy. In 1937, using the pretext of a communist insurrection, President Vargas became Brazil's dictator, censoring the media, creating a cult of personality, and launching labor reforms. However, public opposition to these measures grew until 1945, when, much like he had done to the old government 15 years prior, Getúlio Vargas was overthrown by the military. However, making a surprise political comeback, President Vargas regained the presidency in 1951. However, his second term, although more democratic than his first one, was marred by allegations of corruption. In August 1954, an assassination attempt on an opposition journalist that resulted in the death of a Brazilian Air Force major would be the catalyst for Vargas' second and final downfall. A political crisis erupted as the Brazilian Air Force began its own investigation into the murder. Overwhelmed by the crisis and facing a military coup, on August 24, 1954, President Getulio Vargas died by his own hand. After Vargas' death, Brazil was ruled by a succession of interim presidents until, in 1955, amidst a wave of political optimism, Juscelino Kubitschek, the former governor of the state of Minas Gerais, won the presidency in a free and fair election on October 3rd of that year. In his campaign, Kubitschek had promised 50 years of progress in 5. However, the Brazilian military was bitterly divided as to whether or not Kubitschek, a center-left politician, should be allowed to assume the presidency. One colonel even went so far as to issue a public speech denouncing Kubitschek for alleged communist sympathies. Likewise, the last of the post-Vargas interim presidents, Carlos Luz, also opposed Kubitschek, raising fears he may attempt to interfere with a peaceful transfer of power. Alarmed by these developments, the Brazilian Minister of War, Marshal Henrique Teixeira Lott, resigned in protest and launched a preventative coup against President Luz to guarantee a peaceful transfer of power. On November 11, 1955, army forces loyal to Lott seized control of Rio de Janeiro's most important areas, including the presidential palace. The National Congress of Brazil voted to install a new interim president who was loyal to the democratic process and who would allow Kubitschek to assume the presidency. By the morning of October 12th, the defeated President Luz accepted his loss and resigned in disgrace. Because of the actions of Marshal Lott, who put his loyalty to the country before his loyalty to the military, Juscelino Kubitschek was able to assume the presidency on January 31st, 1956. Kubitschek's presidency was marked by unprecedented political stability and economic prosperity, two things that were sorely needed after decades of authoritarianism and economic uncertainty. Under Kubitschek, foreign companies entered the Brazilian market, stimulating trade. Special attention was given to developing the energy sector, national transportation, the agricultural industry, and the education system. However, the crown jewel of Kubitschek's presidency, his magnum opus, was the construction of a new national capital, the planned city of Brasilia. Incredibly, the city was built in just 41 months, with construction beginning in 1956 and ending in 1960. At the end of his presidency, while many of his campaign promises had been kept, inflation had drastically risen. In 1960, Brazil held its next presidential election, and Juscelino Kubitschek was unable to seek consecutive re-election. Instead, he planned to make a political comeback in the next election. Nevertheless, Kubitschek's Social Democratic Party, also known as the PSD, fought to maintain its hold on power. Its presidential ticket was comprised of presidential nominee Marshal Henrique Teixeira Lott, the Minister of War who'd saved Brazilian democracy just 5 years prior, and Vice President João Goulart, Brazil's vice president who simply opted to continue in his role as vice president. Lott's actions in defense of democracy had garnered him an impressive amount of respect and prestige nationwide, but he was concurrently considered an electorally weak candidate for the 1960 election. In contrast to Marshal Lott's more reserved centrist brand of politics, the star of the 1960 election was Jânio Quadros, a right-wing populist who advertised himself as a political outsider and man of the people. In comparison to Quadros' sensationalist brand of politics, Marshal Lott, despite holding the ideals of democracy and constitutionalism near and dear to his heart, was a stubborn, blunt, and uncharismatic man whose ideals of good governance did not translate well to charismatic ventures such as politics. Given the choice between the reserved Marshal or the firebrand who'd often eat bologna sandwiches during his speeches, on October 3rd, 1960, the Brazilian people elected Jânio Quadros to be Brazil's next president. In a fascinating turn of events, because at the time Brazil elected presidential and vice presidential candidates separately, incumbent vice president and Lott's VP nominee, João Goulart, was also re-elected, becoming Quadros' vice president. Quadros garnered 5.6 million votes to Lott's 3.8 million votes. Additionally, a third candidate, Ademar de Barros, garnered 2.1 million votes. However, despite Quadros winning by a large margin, after his inauguration on January 31st, 1961, his presidency quickly came to be defined by chaos and instability. For the first 3 months of his term, Quadros was away traveling and refused to divulge any sort of outline of his political goals. The Quadros administration suffered from understaffing, and his political leverage dissipated as he alienated his allied parties and pursued issues considered unimportant to the nation, such as banning bikinis and gambling. After less than a year of political disaster, on August 25th, 1961, Jânio Quadros resigned from the presidency, creating a massive political crisis known as the Legality Campaign. Quadros' vice president, João Goulart, was a progressive who was extremely unpopular with the Brazilian military. The Brazilian armed forces were split on whether or not to prevent or allow Goulart's ascension to the presidency. After an attempted coup, various states of Brazil took sides on whether or not to support Goulart, bringing the nation to the brink of civil war. Fortunately, the worst case scenario was avoided by a compromise deal that installed a parliamentary system of government in Brazil, allowing Goulart to become the president but with drastically reduced power. The 1961 Legality Campaign shook Brazil to its core and led to a very weak and unstable government whose leftist nature made it an enemy of the Cold War era United States. From the beginning of Goulart's presidency, he knew his political power was tenuous and rested upon an unstable foundation. From 1962 to early 1964, Brazil suffered immense political instability. After a 1963 referendum saw Goulart regain full political power, his administration and the military were put on a collision course. On March 31st, 1964, all of Brazil's political crises culminated in a coup d'etat that would change the nation forever. Backed by the United States of America as part of Operation Condor, Brazil's military, using anti-communism as its rationale, overthrew the government of João Goulart. The coup began as a revolt by the military in the state of Minas Gerais, but quickly spread across the nation. Goulart's fragile government squandered its opportunity to act and crush the Minas Gerais rebellion quickly. Loyalists in the military awaited their orders to crush the uprising, but these orders never came as the Brazilian government was consumed by chaos. On April 2nd, 1964, the Brazilian Congress legitimized the coup d'etat, formally ending Goulart's presidency. The defeated President Goulart fled to exile in Uruguay, before later moving to Argentina, where he would die under mysterious circumstances on December 6, 1976, with many claiming he was poisoned as part of Operation Condor. As for the nation of Brazil, following the 1964 coup, the Brazilian constitution was suspended and a military dictatorship was established. Extensive censorship was imposed upon Brazilian society, and the practices of torture, disappearing, and extrajudicial killing became not only normalized, but formally institutionalized. Over time, the oppression of the Brazilian people only intensified. However, concurrent with these troubling developments, the Brazilian economy enjoyed an economic miracle during the late 1960s and early 1970s as the Brazilian dictatorship became heavily involved in the Brazilian economy, investing heavily in modernization and further industrialization. Brazil's GDP and its inflation rose side by side as the economic miracle depended heavily on fossil fuels such as oil. By the mid 1970s, however, early sustainable growth had been superseded by unsustainable growth, causing the dictatorship to become dependent on borrowing from international monetary lenders, causing Brazil's national debt to balloon. By the end of the 1970s, suffering from massive debt and an energy crisis, Brazil, the then current holder of the largest debt in the world, entered economic freefall driven by recession and hyperinflation. By 1983, dissatisfaction with the military dictatorship had reached a fever pitch, leading to the rise of a unified resistance movement demanding a return to democracy known as Direita Já, or in English, direct elections now. The Direita Já movement brought together a diverse mixture of different elements of Brazilian society, all united in fighting to end the dictatorship. In 1985, the last president of the Brazilian dictatorship, João Figueiredo, was forced to relinquish power, causing the collapse of the dictatorship, the election of a civilian president, and a return to democracy for Brazil. The legacy of the Brazilian dictatorship was one of brief economic growth along with painful memories of torture, imprisonment, and state-sponsored murder. The legacy of these 21 years of tyranny continues to adversely affect Brazil today, as it reckons not only with the darkest chapters of its history, but continues to struggle with issues such as poverty, crime, and environmental degradation. However, what if, against all odds, the Brazilian military dictatorship never existed? What if Brazilian democracy never ended? Let's find out. Our point of divergence is the 1960 presidential election. Just as in our timeline, Jânio Quadros faces off against Marshall Lott. However, the difference is that in this timeline, the third candidate, Ademar de Barros, who in our timeline knew there was no viable path to the presidency for him and termed his candidacy a protest candidacy, instead drops out of the election on January 1st, 1960. In both timelines, years earlier, Ademar de Barros had lost the Sao Paulo gubernatorial election to Jânio Quadros, his arch-rival. Let's say in this alternate timeline that his electoral loss is much more devastating, profoundly shaping de Barros' outlook on the election and eventually causing him to back Marshall Lott over Quadros, eager to inflict the same electoral defeat upon Quadros, who he blamed for his electoral loss in the past. With 9 months to go until the election, on January 15th, 1960, Ademar de Barros makes a surprise appearance on stage at a Lott election rally, giving a fiery speech to the crowd and formally endorsing Marshall Lott's candidacy. Ademar de Barros' endorsement of Lott makes the election much tighter than in our timeline. Likewise, de Barros implores Lott to refine his gruff persona and make himself more appealing to the masses, a proposal which Lott, after initial refusal, accepts, taking a crash course on effective campaigning from his PR team. Lott's efforts to improve his charisma began to bear fruit, as polls across Brazil showed the election tightening as Lott closed the gap between him and Quadros. On October 3, 1960, the people of Brazil cast their votes in the presidential election, and the supporters of Ademar de Barros heeded his advice and supported Marshall Lott over Quadros. On October 4th, the election is called for Marshall Lott, who wins with 5.9 million votes to Quadros' 5.8 million votes. On October 5th, 1960, after some soul-searching, Jânio Quadros concedes defeat. On January 31st, 1961, Marshal Henrique Teixeira Lott is inaugurated as the 22nd president of Brazil before thousands of supporters in the new capital of Brasilia. By his side are Vice President João Goulart and former President Kubitschek. As a show of unity, Jânio Quadros also attends the ceremony. With the election of President Lott, Brazil enters a new era. At a press conference on February 2nd, Lott declares that his main political goals are to stabilize the Brazilian economy, reduce inflation, and renegotiate the national debt. Privately, his other goal is to reduce the influence of the Brazilian military in the nation's politics to prevent future coup attempts. For now, Marshal Lott has an iron grip on the presidency due to the respect the military has for him personally, but at the same time, he knows his successor might be more vulnerable. Using his loyalists in the military, President Lott strategically reorganizes the armed forces, using reassignments and forced retirement to prevent generals known to have insurrectionist tendencies from ever organizing into a cohesive movement. Following these military reorganization efforts, which take up his first 100 days in office, the summer of 1961 sees President Lott launch a coordinated effort to renegotiate Brazil's $297 million foreign debt. Lott's renegotiation efforts are very successful, with $20 million completely forgiven, and the rest of the foreign debt consolidated in a large loan from the IMF, boasting a 2% interest rate, with the IMF waiving their special drawing right interest rates following pressure from the Kennedy administration, who were convinced to intervene in the matter following stark warnings from President Lott that if the national debt was not controlled, the drastic economic state of the nation could lead to a rise in communist sympathies in Brazil. This debt consolidation and renegotiation leads to a spike in President Lott's approval rating nationwide, with 75% of Brazilians approving of his performance thus far. With Lott's strong leadership, the crises that erupted across Brazil in the early 1960s simply don't happen. At the same time, his reserved centrist style comes across as simply bland to the United States, whose sheer hatred of Goulart in our timeline is replaced by ambivalence and acceptance of Lott's government in Brazil, mainly due to his anti-communism and military credentials. Although not seen as a firm ally, Lott is viewed as a stabilizing figure in Brazil, and Brazil is never drawn into Operation Condor in this alternate timeline. With the United States at peace with the current situation in Brazil, in 1962, at Vice President João Goulart's urging, the Lott administration launches a series of reforms known as the Basic Reforms. These reforms have a myriad of goals, including but not limited to developing underdeveloped areas of the nation, strengthening environmental protections in the Amazon rainforest, strengthening legal protections for uncontacted tribes and contacted tribes living outside Brazilian society, implementing land reform across Brazil's agricultural heartland, increased funding to fight illiteracy, tax cuts for the poorest, increasing incentives for rent-to-own programs, and expanding voting rights to all Brazilians. Concurrently, Goulart's desire to decriminalize being a member of the Communist Party is rejected by Lott. Instead, eager to offset the political ramifications of Goulart's reforms, at Lott's urging, the Brazilian Congress passes new laws further increasing the legal penalties and punishments for joining the Communist Party of Brazil. This is to ensure that if the United States ever grows uncomfortable with Goulart's progressive reforms, Lott has something to counter with to avoid increased tensions. The basic reforms are signed into law on June 1, 1962. The implementation of the basic reforms is rapid, and their popularity is seized upon by Lott's Social Democratic Party just in time for the 1962 congressional elections, which sees the PSD win 150 seats in the Chamber of Deputies and 24 seats in the Brazilian Senate, in a shock to election observers. Fresh off of this huge electoral victory, President Lott takes action against a personal foe of his, American ambassador to Brazil, Lincoln Gordon, who, despite Brazil's good relations with the United States, has been on a personal mission to drag elements of the Brazilian government and military into Operation Condor. On December 15, 1962, Ambassador Gordon is expelled by the Brazilian government. Lott later discloses privately his thoughts on Ambassador Gordon, stating, "He is not an ambassador of his nation to ours, as much as he is an agent seeking to destabilize our nation for the benefit of his own." Acknowledging Gordon's shortcomings, the Kennedy administration taps former Food for Peace director George McGovern to be the new ambassador to Brazil, which he accepts, going on to work hand in hand with the Lott administration to secure as much American support as possible to eliminate hunger and poverty in Brazil. The remainder of Lott's term is spent cementing his early political wins to effect lasting and sustainable positive change in Brazil. By the end of his term, his wise management of the economy had brought down inflation and reduced the national debt to $100 million US. On October 3, 1965, Brazil holds its next presidential election, with the term-limited President Lott unable to run. The election's primaries are merely a formality. This is because the election's two main candidates had been all but decided before the primaries had even begun. In December 1964, former President Kubitschek announced his intent to run for president again in 1965. Likewise, in reaction to the rise of a stable center-left government, a party known as the National Renewal Alliance, or ARENA for short, rose to prominence in Brazil, fueled by reactionaries, traditionalists, and those with a grievance against the basic reforms. ARENA's candidate for the election was Arthur da Costa e Silva. Unsurprisingly, President Kubitschek makes a successful comeback, defeating Costa e Silva with 61% of the vote and beginning his second term as president on January 31, 1966. João Goulart, now firmly entrenched as vice president, is also re-elected to yet another term in office, with a popular joke in Brazil at the time being there are three certainties in life: death, taxes, and Vice President Goulart. Kubitschek's second term in office is mostly spent on expanding Lott's various reforms, whilst at the same time taking measures to further reduce the national debt and inflation, setting Brazil on the path for continuous sustainable growth throughout the rest of the 1960s. However, the landmark accomplishment of his second term in office is a favela clearing program designed to eliminate the densely populated slums across Rio de Janeiro and other Brazilian cities. The solution to this issue posed by the Kubitschek government is compensation packages and resettlement subsidies for the affected families to resettle in Brazil's more rural areas, to live in newly built settlements comprised of agricultural cooperatives and rent-to-own housing, which results in a hugely successful and lasting decrease of the total number of favelas in Brazil. At the same time, however, the Cold War had begun to heat up in South America, as Operation Condor began influencing regime change in Brazil's neighboring countries. Although Marshal Lott had laid the foundation of an apolitical military, that did not mean political forces within the country had simply given up on removing the PSD from power. Baseless allegations of corruption would plague Kubitschek for the rest of his term, leading to ARENA growing in strength. In the run-up to the 1970 election, tensions were high in Brazil as the PSD sought to continue its 14 years in power. This was easy political fodder for ARENA, who claimed that the real tyrants had not been in the military but in the civilian government, and began to refer to the government as a dictatorship. This dangerous misuse of language led to a brutal election season as political discourse in Brazil became increasingly violent and the populace increasingly polarized. The PSD, eager to retain power, sought to realign the party more towards the center after years of drifting further left, which had generated accusations that the party was secretly communist or at least led by fellow travelers. The result of this was the nomination of Marshal Amaury Cruel as the PSD's nominee for the 1970 election. Cruel's advanced age, as well as his perceived right-wing sympathies, was detrimental to the PSD's support base in the run-up to the 1970 election. Party unity was frayed as the PSD's ever-growing youthful demographics revolted against the decision to nominate Cruel, leading to riots at the 1970 party convention and a protest vote involving dozens of party delegates nominating rock star Raul Seixas as the party nominee. Capitalizing on this inter-party chaos, Arena moderated its rhetoric as the election neared in order to pick up dissatisfied PSD voters. On October 3, 1970, Arena's presidential candidate, Emilio Garrastazu Medici, wins the election with 51% of the vote, becoming the 24th president of Brazil on January 31, 1971. The one constant in this maddening election was João Goulart, who was yet again elected vice president by the people of Brazil, with some attributing his circumstances to a so-called Goulart curse. Despite ending the 14 years of PSD rule, President Medici's fortunes change quickly. A massive controversy erupts in October 1971 after an initiative to reduce the national minimum wage is discovered to have been snuck into a funding bill at Medici's urging. The ensuing scandal costs Medici a sizable amount of political capital, further compounded by gridlock in the Chamber of Deputies, which was still dominated by the PSD. The fall of Medici would ironically coincide with the rise of another right-wing leader. On September 11, 1973, the Marxist government of Salvador Allende in Chile was toppled in a military coup by General Augusto Pinochet. Under President Medici, Brazil was the first nation to recognize the Chilean military junta, somehow recognizing it even faster than the United States. The endorsement of the Chilean coup results in mass protests across Brazil, who view Medici as a prospective authoritarian himself. On September 25, 1973, a private recording of Medici is leaked to the public in which he bemoans the path Brazil had taken since 1955, most infamously stating that Lott, Goulart, Kubitschek, all traitors. They never belonged anywhere near positions of power. They belong back against a wall facing a firing squad. Medici's incendiary comments ignite a political crisis in Brazil as the Brazilian military leadership immediately issues a statement denouncing Medici's comments, in tandem with similar denunciations by politicians across Brazil, including elder statesmen such as Kubitschek, Quadros, and Lott. Vice President Goulart announces his refusal to continue working with Medici, and public opinion on the president sours so rapidly that on October 5, 1973, the Chamber of Deputies began impeachment proceedings against President Medici, whose approval rating enters freefall before settling at 21%. By November, Medici's own party, the National Renewal Alliance, privately decides to abandon him as, quote, a sacrificial lamb to the Brazilian public. The impeachment process is fast-tracked after Medici loses all support, with his powers being suspended on December 21st. On December 31st, 1973, President Medici is found guilty of imperiling national unity, promoting the suppression of political rights, and inciting political violence, and is removed from office in a unanimous vote in the Brazilian Senate. In its first test in decades, Brazilian democracy had withstood a major threat. Medici, claiming political persecution, flees into exile in Paraguay after being offered political asylum by Paraguayan President Alfredo Stroessner. On December 31st, 1973, Vice President João Goulart assumes the responsibilities of the presidency, becoming the 25th president of Brazil. Serving out the remainder of Medici's term, Goulart's time as president is dedicated to mending national unity and decreasing polarization. The 1975 election is an easy victory for the progressives of Brazil, but this time the PSD does not come out on top. After the disastrous 1970 election, the PSD, which had long dominated Brazil's left-wing coalition, was overtaken by the Brazilian Labour Party, or PTB for short. On October 3, 1975, PTB candidate Leonel Brizola defeats Arena candidate Ernesto Geisel in a landslide. Brizola's vice presidential candidate is, of course, João Goulart, who famously said, "It is my destiny to be vice president of Brazil. Seriously, I wasn't even on the ballot and they still elected me vice president. What is happening?" The rest of the 1970s sees a reorientation of Brazilian politics, with Arena imploding as the PSD and PTB alliance phrase, with the PSD drifting further towards the center and absorbing the more moderate elements of the National Renewal Alliance, with the more extreme elements of Arena coalescing to reform the Integralist Party, or PI for short. Concurrent with this political realignment, Brazilian society had become permanently oriented towards the center-left, as well as its military having become completely apolitical. The 1980s would go on to be defined by political struggle between the PSD and PTB, a far cry from the struggle for democracy that dominated Brazil in the 1980s in our timeline. In the 1990 election, the PSD nominates Itamar Franco, a senator from Minas Gerais, to be its candidate for the presidency. Concurrent with Franco's candidacy, the PTB nomination process is taken over by a grassroots movement known as the Lulista movement, comprised of the Brazilian youth. This grassroots movement seeks to end poverty in Brazil completely, once and for all. The Lulista movement's namesake comes from the name of its leader, a fiery young union organizer named Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly referred to as Lula for short. By Lula's side is his closest political ally, best friend, and vice presidential candidate, famed Army Captain Jair Bolsonaro, a major left-wing human rights activist and veteran who'd stirred controversy by leading efforts for the promotion of egalitarian ideals in the military, and also for claiming that his time in the army had been the catalyst for his adoption of progressive beliefs, which drew into question just how apolitical the army was after years of left-wing rule in Brazil. The Lula-Bolsonaro ticket secures the PTB's nomination for that year's election, and riding on a wave of popular support for the charismatic duo, they win the presidency and vice presidency on October 3, 1990, the 30-year anniversary of Marshal Lott's 1960 victory, which had paved the way for Brazil's incredible 30 years of progress. Vice President Goulart, upon hearing of the Lula-Bolsonaro ticket's victory, was quoted as saying, "Oh, thank God, I'm finally free." On January 31st, 1991, hundreds of thousands flocked to Brasilia to see the inauguration of Lula and Bolsonaro. Former Presidents Kubitschek, Lott, and Goulart are in attendance to witness the inauguration. With the Cold War coming to an end, the Brazilian Republic looked to the future with hope, eager to expand its role in the world in the new post-Cold War era. Without any knowledge of how different things could have been in another world, another time, Brazilian democracy was stronger than ever.